Welcome to the Science of Success exclusive subscriber video course, how you can create time for what really matters in life. We've polled hundreds of Science of Success listeners and subscribers, and this is a word cloud of their responses. As you can see, time was the most important thing that people wanted help with. The biggest thing that listeners had questions about, creating more time in their lives. And that's why we created this guide based on listener demand for what people wanted to help people create more time for what's most important, to help you create more time for what's most important in your life. I want to start with this concept of contemplative routines. Contemplative routines are incredibly powerful, and we're going to go into and share the specific strategies and action steps for executing a contemplative routine in your life today. But I wanted to start with a quote from Charles Duhigg. He's a previous guest on the Science of Success, and I think this quote perfectly encapsulates the power of contemplative routines and how they can help you create more time in your life by focusing your priorities and understanding what really matters and what creates the actual results you want in your life. Quote, "What actually seems to correlate with success is that the people who are most productive and most successful, they tend to have what researchers refer to as contemplative routines, as habits in their life that push them to think more deeply." Journaling is a great example of this because the act of journaling oftentimes forces us to sit down and try to make sense of how we spent our time recently, what our goals actually ought to be, as opposed to what we happen to just get obsessed with or fixated on right now, and how we should arrange our life so that those priorities, so that our energy and activity is actually focused on our priorities rather than instantly responding to life's many sorts of busy work requests. The basic insight here is that particularly now, being busy and being productive are not synonymous. That's a critical insight. Being busy and being productive are not synonymous. And that's why so many people feel starved for time. You know, Tim Ferriss has an amazing quote that lack of time is actually lack of priorities. And we're going to get into how to use these contemplative routines that Charles Duhigg says research refers to as one of the biggest characteristics of people who are incredibly productive and successful. We're going to show you concretely how to implement a contemplative routine in your life. Before we dig into the specifics of this contemplative routine, I want to talk just a little bit about leverage and how you can create leverage on your time. Is getting more time just a question of sacrifice? Is it a question of just doing more with your day, sleeping less, making more happen? We're going to use a financial example with money to look at this, but this doesn't just have to do with money. You can create time for whatever matters in your life, whether it's spending time with your children, your family, your significant other, whether it's playing video games, whether it's golfing, fishing, whatever matters to you, whatever's most important. It's not just about creating more time. It's not just about working harder, getting less sleep. And money showcases this so spectacularly that that's why I want to look at this. So if you're making $100,000 a year and you're working 40 hours a week, it's easy to kind of conceive of, okay, if I work twice as hard, I'm going to suddenly make $200,000 a week, right? But let's extend that logic. What if you worked every single hour, every single possible hour? There's 168 hours in a week. If you follow that logic all the way, you would cap out at about $420,000. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because obviously there are humans out there. There are people that make more than that. And there's an extreme example that I think encapsulates this so perfectly. Let's look at the most possible extreme, because I think sometimes looking at the extremes showcases the fundamental principles that are really at work here. So let's look at Warren Buffett. Can you work as hard as Warren Buffett? In 2013, according to WealthX data, Warren Buffett made $12.7 billion. Now let's assume that he's working hard. He's working 80 hours a week. That would equate to about $3 million per hour worked, right? And that's 65,000 times more efficient, more high leverage than somebody who's working 80 hours a week and making $200,000 a year. So what's the disconnect here? Warren Buffett can't possibly be working 65,000 times harder, right? There's just simply not enough hours in the day for that to actually mathematically be possible. So something else is going on here. What's happened is that Warren Buffett has achieved leverage on his time. He's become someone who's high leverage. Is he working super hard? He says that he self-admits that he spends 80% of his time reading, sitting in his office reading. And this comes back to the power of contemplative routines. Warren Buffett spends 80% of his time on contemplative routines like reading, learning, thinking, zooming out, and considering the big picture. How much of your time are you currently spending on contemplative routines? The way that Warren Buffett has created such tremendous leverage in his life is because he's dedicated 80% of his time to being in a space of contemplative routines and focusing, zooming out, and figuring out what's really important and what really matters. Let's look briefly at the 80-20 principle. I'm sure you've heard of the 80-20 principle, but it's incredibly important to understand. The simple idea behind the 80-20 principle is that 20% of the things you do create 80% of the results in your life, right? 20% of the things you do create 80% of the results. That means 80% of the stuff you do is largely meaningless. It creates the less than 20% of the actual outputs and things that you want in your life. The 80-20 principle is fascinating. It explains everything from rabbit populations to the distribution of craters on the moon, to the distribution of files on your hard drive, to the wealth and income of nations and the wealth and income of individuals. And it's a principle that you can use, that you can harness. It's a specific example of a contemplative routine that we're going to get into how to concretely apply. But I wanted you to understand the governing idea, the fundamental principle of the 80-20 principle before we dig into the specifics. The other thing I wanted to look at is this notion of compound time, right, versus conventional time. That 80% of the time that most people spend their lives on is the conventional time, that space outside of contemplative routines. But contemplative routines compound on each other. Once you start using them, you can take the insights, apply them, and then do it again. It's an iterative and recursive process. And by doing that, the results that you get start compounding. You start becoming more high leverage. You start getting more leverage on your time. And eventually you end up like somebody like Warren Buffett, who spends a tremendous amount of their time in this area, this space of compound time, and then creates incredible results for themselves because they've achieved so much leverage on their time. So how do you get more done by focusing on less, right? We talked earlier about this idea that lack of time is actually about lack of priorities. It's not about working harder. It's about focusing on the right things. This is how you can create time in your life for what actually matters. The research demonstrates this. That's what Charles Duhigg talked about. So do the anecdotal examples like Warren Buffett, right? The way to achieve extraordinary results is to get leverage on your time. And a really interesting thing about the 80-20 principle, which we're going to dig into in just a second and show you how to concretely apply to your life, is that you can apply it not only to business things, not only to financial outcomes, but you can apply it to your personal life. You can apply it to happiness, to joy, to fun, to things that you like. It's an incredibly flexible contemplative routine, an incredibly flexible tool. And I'm going to show you how you can apply it to your life now.